Welcome back. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. So we're squirting paint on this FC, and how I determined what color to paint it is really easy. I found a color of Rust-Oleum I liked called Regal Red, and that way I could paint little detail things without having to mix up paint. So I took a sample of this color and went down to the automotive paint store and had them match it, and they came up with, I think it was a 1997-ish Land Rover red of some sort. So they mixed me up a gallon of that to paint this thing with. I've learned a lot of stuff about painting, not necessarily what to do, but what not to do. This is the first thing I've ever painted from bare metal up. So I've done a couple cars in my life, but they were just quick repaints or little sections, and much easier than something of this magnitude. So here we go. First thing first, I made sure everything was really clean and cleaned it again just to make sure. I did build a little makeshift paint booth. It didn't do me much good other than keeping the rest of the shop from getting red, but it had no ventilation, so limited there. First thing to happen on the paint was epoxy primer. I primered every square inch of bare metal on this thing. Not all at once, mind you, but in sections. I actually did have to tape off areas, primer some areas, then I would coat those areas in paint, then come back and prime other areas and coat the next spot. The first thing that ended up with paint was the underside, but it really wasn't paint. I used Raptor liner on the entire underside in black. I thought that gave it a good coat and a good look. The next section I was painting was the lower portion of the interior, and that's also done in Raptor liner or bed liner. I learned a little technique. I was taught by, a YouTube guy about you can do color on color painting. So if your epoxy's still not set up, you can add color to it right away and it really grabs hold. You can also change some color hues doing that. Well, I sprayed the inside of this with Raptor liner in red and discovered it was a little brighter than what I wanted from the color that Raptor liner offers. So while this was still wet, I mixed up some of the red paint that we put on the body here, and I shot over the Raptor liner while it was still not set up. And I'll tell you what, it worked really well. It didn't peel, it didn't react, it absorbed in, it made the color just right on the money. The last section I used black Raptor liner on was the inside of the roof cap. I masked it off and shot it with that bed liner material and then let it dry. The first part of actual paint I painted now is the roof cap. I masked everything off and just painted the roof cap red. The next section for paint was my flat black or semi-gloss black for the upper cab and grille. So I masked everything off and just painted the band around the cab and then the grille. Next was squirting color on the main body of the cab. Once I got one coat on, I let it dry and then basically just used a Scotch-Brite to dull it down, rough it up enough for a second coat. So I ended up with 2 coats of a single stage paint. Now, just so you know, I think 2-stage is easier because you paint color and then you paint gloss. This kind of gloss is all in its own reaction, and I've determined I'm not very good at it. After the second coat, I let it tack up a little bit and then pulled all my masking paper off to see what I had. Overall, I was happy with it. There were a couple of places that I did have to remask and touch up, mostly because I'm a klutz and dinged it up before it was dry. The next was the smaller items. I started with the rear fenders and the front fenders and coated them fully in epoxy. The underside of the front fenders, I did some more of that coating. The rear fenders, I started off painting them black, and the inside of those bed skirts, I also painted them in black. Once the black was dry, I flipped them over and painted the red on the skirts, and after that, I just primered and painted all of some of the interior accessories like the engine cover and bumperettes and stuff. Once the paint was dry, it was time to start doing some reassembly. First thing were the struts to tilt the cab, and then it was on to the door and door glass. I had to fix window cranks to get the door glass working and had some stuff to do on the inside of the door, so I figured that was probably a good place to start. Onward to the front bumper. I straightened the original front bumper enough to use it, and it worked okay. Then I mounted the mirrors. It was kind of hard drilling holes in that nice plate that I mounted there, but I needed it and it worked. Then I mounted the rear skins and the rear fenders. The interior was next, and that takes longer than anything. I started with the brake master mount and the steering column mount. Then I installed the plates to cover the steering column, and then I installed that boot. And that boot's there because it has to articulate and move up and down and back and forth. The doghouse was one of the easier pieces to install. Just put some new weather stripping on and bolted her in, put the latches on, and I'm good to go. The shifter was next after I put the secondary doghouse cover on. Now the shifter's a long ways away from the hinge, so it takes a long cable. I've got eyelets set up like a fishing pole and a spring to return it as the cab comes back down. Next up, I installed the tin flashing for the heater box, and that way I could run the main trunk harness for the wiring. Now underneath you can see the length of this trunk line. I also wanted to show the length and flex on the accelerator cable and brake lines because they have to move with the cab, but they're close to the hinge, so they didn't have to move as much as like the shifter does. Finished up mounting the hard lines for the brakes and then the steering column. Then I mounted the heater box and heater core along with the transfer case shifter. Now for some fun stuff. I mounted all the gauges and switches into my dash and discovered after I test fit it that I needed to raise the level of the dash up about 1.5 inches. So I welded these pieces of tube and used longer bolts to the original mounting areas inside the cab, and it fit just perfect. Next step was I wired everything I could in the dash before I mounted it. Then I went ahead and mounted the dash into the cab of the unit. Now that the dash is mounted and everything on the back side is wired as far as I can, we're going to start with turn signals. Well, the next video I'm going to finish the wiring, but I wanted to cover the turn signals on this FC right now because they'll take a little bit of time. You notice there's no room on the column to put a little turn signal switch because the whole column moves and everything else. Now, you can get turn signal control units that you mount on the dash face, but I really didn't want to go that direction. It's really simple to do turn signals. You need a two-way toggle switch, which means you run your power from your flasher in the center pole, and then you run one side to your left side and the other side to your right side. That's really simple. Easy to follow so far. Your front signals come directly off the switch and the flasher, as well as your turn signal indicators. Now, on the rear lights, because the rear lights are a shared bulb and you need to separate a brake light from a turn signal light. So I used to do these with a big relay pack. Now I just use one of these little trailer light controllers. You can pick these up from any trailer supply store. Here we go. My favorite thing to do is wiring. This is a real simple way to do those brake lights, like I was just telling you on the brake light controller. So here's the wiring diagram, and I'm just going to go over this diagram real quick so it's easy to understand. First thing is you have a single pole dual throw switch, so you can do left, right, and off. Off, on is the way the switch is labeled. Now keep in mind, on your swing it to the right, it's going to go to the opposite side. Swing it to the left, it's going to go to the opposite side. Now on these connection points, I happen to use a threaded connector, so I would use an eyelet. You can do these in a spade connector as well. So on these, I will wire the spade connector, and I will have two wires coming out of it. One wire I will run a splice somewhere, which is basically here. So that way I have a right front bulb and a right front indicator. Same thing with the left side. I have a left front bulb and a left front indicator coming directly off these poles. Now the middle pole, flasher, positive side of the fuse box. Simple. Okay. Now it gets a little more confusing. Your third wire coming off this pole, which would be here, comes down, comes over, and goes into that brake light control box. Same thing with the left side. It'll go into the left side control box. Then you have a brake light switch. You have a positive from your fuse box to the brake light switch, from the brake light switch into the brake light controller. This box does its little magic thing, and out of the box you have a right side brake and turn and a left side brake and turn. Now some of these boxes have an in and an out for tail lights, and some of them don't. Don't worry about the tail lights, they just pass through if it is on the box. Tail lights are their own circuit. Back here on your left rear brake and turn, on an 1157 bulb, the bright side of the light is the turn signal and stop. The dim side of the bulb is tail light. So you actually have three things happening in one light bulb. If you're using LED lights, the bright one is obviously your brake and turn, and the dim one is obviously the tail lights. So what this brake controller is doing is it's seeing a turn signal and it's seeing a brake light. And if the power is on to the right signal, it is diverting the brake lights to the left side. So we'll get a flash on the right side, a brake on the left side. In reverse, the same thing. Simple. Feel free to use this diagram. I'm sure there's other versions of this all over the internet, but this works really well and it's really easy. I welded a tab onto the steering and brake frame and a tab on the brake pedal, and then just mounted a Chevy brake light switch. Here's the single pole dual throw switch. You can see that. And then here's where I mounted the little brake light controller. And then back over here, you can see the back side of that switch. Back to assembly, I painted the sun visors and reassembled those, and then I also installed this edging all the way around the edge on the roof cap since I'm not using a real headliner. And I don't know where I found this, but it's a really cool little LED dome light that I installed. I decided I needed cup holders, so I took a piece of that diamond plate aluminum and broke it so that I had a level mounting surface, and then I just used a couple of quart paint cans I got from the hardware store and mounted those for my cup holders. I decided an air horn was a fitting piece of equipment on this. As hard as it was to drill holes in the roof of this, I went ahead and did it and mounted my horn. Like I said earlier, I found some PRP seats. They're only 19 inches across at the frame, so they actually fit in this. And I had them do the upholstery so it matched my interior just pretty darn close. On the side windows and the rear glass, I ordered a sheet of tinted glass for those and had them installed. On the front window, we used the original glass, and I had cut the original gasket out, but I was able to find a new old stock gasket for one of these, which is pretty cool. I decided on that hole that used to accommodate the bumper struts, I needed something in there, so I measured it and I found some LED driving lights that I mounted in there and wired up, and they worked just perfect. On the rear of the cab, I mounted a new piece of the expanded metal for the airflow, and then I really didn't need the airflow, so I went ahead and mounted a piece of diamond plate aluminum, which I can remove if I need that airflow back. On the inner fender wells, these have a set of louvered panels, which they commonly called gills. Mine were in pretty good shape, but I sent them into Salt Lake City chrome shop and had them chromed, and I think it was a good decision based on looks. Based on the amount of money I spent, probably not so much. It sure did make a nice finishing touch to the cab, though. Couple other little things I finished up. One was some little inner door panel covers and reupholstered my armrest. I also added these truckers aluminum hand grabs so I could get in this thing a little bit easier. Remember the exhaust tips that were too short? So I ordered the long ones and installed those. They're above the cab now, which is where I want them. Now I can't use my flamethrowers with these long ones, but I kept all the solenoids for something a little bit different, which, well, may not be a good idea, but here it is. This engine, it's really not built for it, and it's got some miles on it on top of it. But there's a lot of times I do things not because I should, but because I can. Well, that's going to do it for this video. The next video is going to be the final one for this FC series, so we'll be wrapping it up next time, finishing up some wiring, finishing up some detail items, and then taking it for a cruise. So we will see you then, and please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it.